back. Hope you've enjoyed a cup of coffee. So it's time now to get the next bite-sized insight, which is entitled The Democratization of Opportunity. And to deliver this 10-minute speech, I will be inviting onto the stage John Henderson, who is an alumnus of the London Business School, who just freshly graduated from his MBA just a year ago. He's the principal of White Star Capital, but many of you may know of this very talented young gentleman because he was the former COO of Summly, and he's also worked for companies like Facebook. So, John, I'd like to invite you to the stage to share the democratization of opportunity.
So we've heard an awful lot today about the possibilities of technology, about the threats and the opportunities. I want to come at that story from a slightly different angle. I want to tell you about an emperor, a chessboard, and my former boss who was 16 years old. Let me start with some first principles though. One thing that's been bandied around a lot today is one of the best known but least well understood concepts in computing. Moore's Law. For those of you that don't know the history of Moore's Law, it's actually kind of important. So Gordon Moore was a co-founder of Intel. And in 1965, he noticed that every 18 months or so, the number of transistors that his team could fit on a silicon chip was doubling compared to the previous period. And he predicted that this would continue. That prediction was obviously incredibly prescient. Moore's Law holds true to today, 49 years later, and is expected to continue. But it's really easy to look at this and go, oh yeah, I get it. Computers are going to get faster, they're going to get better, and they're going to get cheaper. But that is far less than half the story. The real implication of Moore's Law, and the really important thing about it, is the doubling. We're talking about exponential growth. And that's something that our brains just aren't wired to understand well. So I want to illustrate it with an example that Ray Kurzweil made famous. It relates to the invention of chess. Chess was invented in the 6th century in India, in the Gupta Empire. And the story goes that the inventor of chess took the game to the emperor, and they played a couple of times. The emperor was impressed. So impressed, in fact, that he suggested that the inventor receive a reward and offered that he let him name it. Modestly, the inventor said, all I really need is some rice, just enough rice for me and my family. Let's use the chessboard to calculate how much rice I should receive. Why don't you place 1 grain of rice on the first square of the chessboard, 2 grains of rice on the second square, 4 grains of rice on the third square, and just keep doubling the number of grains of rice until you fill up the chessboard. There's only 64 squares. So be it, said the emperor. That seems fine. And this is where he fell into that same trap of not truly understanding the power of exponential numbers. Let's take a really quick walk through the chessboard. The first half of the chessboard, the emperor's fine. The numbers get quite big quite quickly as they double, but they're not numbers that the emperor can't supply. By the time he's at the 32nd square on the chessboard, the emperor owes the inventor roughly 4 billion grains of rice. That's a lot of rice, but it's only a large field's worth, so the emperor can still handle this. It's once we get onto the second half of the chessboard that things get really interesting. It only takes a handful of more doublings, past 4 billion, and you start getting into numbers that the human brain really can't handle. They're not numbers we deal with every day, and they're numbers that we have trouble conceptualizing. Get onto the 64th square of the chessboard, and the emperor owes the inventor 18 quintillion grains of rice. If that were a pile of rice, it'd be bigger than Mount Everest. It's also more rice than has ever been produced in history. This is Moore's Law. Moore's Law says that computer performance is doubling every 18 months. Let's take a look at that in terms of computers. On screen is the ASCII Red. This was the world's fastest supercomputer in 1996. It cost the US military $55 million to create. It took up a room roughly the size of a tennis court, and it was used to simulate nuclear explosions. 9 years later, and with Moore's Law still applying in full force, a computer of equivalent processing power was released onto the market. But the application of Moore's Law meant that instead of taking up a tennis court, it fit in a shoebox. And instead of costing $55 million to create, it retailed for $500. And it wasn't used to simulate nuclear explosions, it was used to graph them and other cool things on TV screens. It was the PlayStation 3 from Sony. Now, I give you this example to show you how Moore's law has operated, but I think the really significant point here is this is the first half of the chessboard. Gordon Moore made his observation in 1965, some 49 years ago. It's now 2014, and only now are we moving on to the second half of the chessboard. So if you feel like technological innovations are happening faster than they ever have before, if you feel like computers are able to do things that might have been unimaginable, say 10 years ago, that's because they are. Google now has cars driving by themselves around California. The world's best Jeopardy player since 2012 has been a supercomputer owned by IBM. It's called Watson. Amazon is able to algorithmically predict the types of products that you want to buy much more accurately than your local salesman in a department store. And if you were to reach into your pocket right now and pull out your smartphone, you could ask Siri what the weather's like in Sydney or how best to get to Tower Bridge, and it would respond to you like a human being. These innovations are coming online really quickly, and it's because we're moving on to the second half of the chessboard. Now, speaking of Siri, there's a second tectonic shift going on that I want to discuss, and that's the rise of the smartphone. If you haven't seen this graph, it's the one that matters. This is global unit sales of smartphones versus PCs over time. We hit the point in 2013 where there were more internet-connected smartphones in the world than PCs had ever been created. Now, obviously, the smartphone is enabled by the advancement of computer processing that I've discussed. But what's more interesting about the prevalence of smartphones is that the access they give to technologies that are being enabled. In 2017, there's going to be more than 2.5 billion smartphone users worldwide. That's a significant portion of the population walking around with a computer in their pocket that they can access wherever they are at any time. And this confluence of exponentially increasing computer processing power and a new distribution channel that a big chunk of the world's population will have is creating tremendous opportunity. We're starting to see that opportunity in the market. Companies like WhatsApp and Uber have both been valued at over $17 billion in the last few months. But let me give you a slightly more personal example of the opportunity this creates. In the middle of 2012, I met a 16-year-old called Nick. Here he is, pictured on the left. And for what it's worth, Nick finished his A-levels just today, so if he's watching on the webcast, congrats, dude. Nick had created a summarization algorithm. What that is essentially a computer program that can take a long piece of text, let's say an encyclopedia article, and summarize it automatically down to a size that can fit on your iPhone screen. This is pretty powerful stuff. I joined Nick in the middle of 2012, and our vision was clear. Everyone wants to read web pages and consume the internet on smartphones, but the internet really isn't designed for smartphones. You've got great big long Wikipedia pages, emails are too long, the news is too hard to read, it's too hard to navigate, and it's not well formatted. So we set out to summarize it. We started with news, and we released an app, I think in November of 2012, onto the App Store. It was an overnight success. We had hundreds of thousands of downloads, and we raced to #1 in the App Store in over 50 countries. But I think the interesting thing about what we were doing at Summly in the context of this conversation today is what was happening on the back end. So just a few months after launch, we were automatically summarizing over 200,000 news articles every single day. And bear in mind that summarization is a task that up until very recently, only humans could complete. So there we were, a 16-year-old and a very small team, beginning to disrupt an industry as old as news. So Summly was acquired in April of 2013 by Yahoo, and it'll be really interesting to see what happens with the technology now it's in their hands. And I think the point of this is the opportunity that technology is creating and that it's accessible to anyone. Even a 16-year-old can start disrupting an industry through the prevalence of smartphones and through the availability of computer processing power on the cloud. That's the kind of opportunity I'm looking for now at White Star Capital. I'm looking for talented entrepreneurs with small teams who can create technologies based on this exponentially increasing computer power as a result of Moore's law, and who can distribute them through channels like smartphones. There's a real opportunity there, and I'd encourage all of you to think about technology in that way. Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee recently wrote a great book called The Second Machine Age, which I encourage all of you to read. and which I borrowed from today. They talk about a coming digital revolution. The thinking goes that over 200 years ago, the invention of the steam engine kicked off the Industrial Revolution. Tasks that could previously only be completed using muscle power were replaced with engines and machines and factories. And we all know the transformative effect that had on the economy. As we move on to the second half of the chessboard, and as Moore's law continues to hold true, this is happening with digital technology. So innovations like machine learning, like natural language processing, and like artificial intelligence are doing for brain power what the steam engine did for muscle power. I think it's hard to understate how important that'll be, and it's hard to imagine an industry that won't be affected by this. In that sense, Mark Andreessen is absolutely right when he says that software is eating the world. So I'd leave you with two takeaways, I guess. The first relates to Moore's law. Understand the implication of exponential growth. Understand that we're moving on to the second half of the chessboard and that technologies will come onto the market faster and faster. For you as a group of current and future business leaders, that means that the big strategic decisions that you take will need to be done faster and more often than you've ever done before. The second takeaway relates to your competitors. They may not be the same companies that you've been dealing with for the last 10, 20, 30 years. It might just as easily be that a 16-year-old and a bunch of smart engineers in one small room in Shoreditch are your real competitors today. So the chessboard is laid out in front of you. It's up to you to make the right moves. Thank you.